Hello there, friends and neighbors. Thanks for coming back to my channel. This is me, Stella Hendricks, and today we are going to be talking about this May 1959 Life magazine. I actually got it because I thought it would have a really good story about Baby Doe Tabor in there, right? Turns out there's actually just one tiny paragraph about her, but I found some stories about some other really interesting ladies, so I'll read a few of those. Isn't this the hugest magazine you ever saw in your life? I guess back in the 1950s, they liked their magazines more like coffee table books, which I love coffee table books, but I did not expect this magazine to be so huge. Also, it's falling apart, and I have to try and take care of it, but I'm usually not very good at that, am I? As we all know. The Frontier's fabulous women, brave, strong-minded, and gay ladies helped tame the pioneers. Oh, Robert Wallace, you don't know how true that is. Okay. The Western woman, or pioneer mother, is a sainted figure, immortal in bronze, history books, and the hearts of her descendants. Stalwartly, she strides towards the sunset, holding her child by the hand, her piercing glance forever fixed on the horizon. The wife of a farmer or cattleman or prospector, gallantly and obscurely suffering and enduring in a covered wagon, log cabin, or sod house, she comes immediately to mind in her faded sunbonnet whenever the words West and woman are put together. But she is less a person than an institution, as sainted figures frequently are. If she may be left on her great and deserved eminence, there are other Western women worth looking at. Fabulous women, not of bronze but flesh and blood, as are those portrayed in these next 8 pages. Alright. Many opportunistic women undertook to solve the problem immediately and forthrightly. It means the problem of not very many women being in the West. As soon as a cow town or a mining camp grew large enough to have a few saloons and a general store, prostitutes arrived from the east to set up shop. First came the miners to work in the mine, then came the ladies who lived on the line, says an old ballad. They established themselves in rows of one-room shacks called cribs, and often hung out shingles bearing their trade's name. Spanish Queen, Molly Be Damn, Little Gold Dollar, M. Set 'em Straight, Peg Leg Annie, Contrary Mary, and others of a more ribald nature. It may be deplored that these light ladies should have been prominent on the great train of women who tamed and civilized the male West, but it remains a fact, and there is no reason to face it here. There were many who were good at heart and were held in wide esteem. A miner who knew Molly Be Damn in Idaho in the 1880s described her as an uncommonly ravishing personality. Her face gave no evidence of dissipation. About her at times was an atmosphere of refinement and culture. She quoted with apparent understanding from Shakespeare, from Milton, from Dante. In addition, Molly Be Damn and her colleagues had qualities which the rough frontiersmen who took things at face value greatly admired. All right. So it's got a whole bunch of ladies in here. I'm only going to read about a couple of them, including Louise Mackey, because she is a Virginia City gal, and I love Virginia City. The Bonanza King's Queen. Luck at first cursed and then bountifully blessed the lovely Maria Louise Antoinette Hungerford. Her mother was a seamstress, her father a barber. In 1854, the family journeyed from New York to seek gold in California. They found only hard times. At 16, Louise married a doctor who in 6 years was dead of drink and drug addiction. Alone in Virginia City, Nevada, Louise supported herself and her daughter as a seamstress. Then in 1867, at 23, Louise married John Mackey, an Irish immigrant who had worked his way up through the mines and was already rich. In 1873, the Virginia Consolidated Mine, of which he was part owner, became the biggest of the bonanzas, and he came to be worth over $50 million. He did not care for social life, but Louise did, and he humored her. Snubbed by New York society, the Mackeys successfully invaded Paris and London, entertained and were entertained by royalty. A handsome matron when she posed for a portrait in Paris, Louise Mackey ended up an unquestioned grande dame of New York and European society. Ooh. Okay. If anyone ever painted a picture of me and then I saw that, you know how pissed off I would be? What is even that hat? I know it was like stylish back in the day, but that is the worst. All of your posterity gets you to see you like that, like a Cabbage Patch doll or something for the rest of time. Okay, here we go. Beautiful portrait of baby doe Tabor. Mistress of the Matchless. Her astonishing, soulful beauty fitted the legend Baby Doe would become. Born Elizabeth McCourt, she was 25 and a divorcee when in 1880 she captured the fancy of Horace A.W. Tabor, once a struggling shopkeeper and now a multi-millionaire in Leadville, Colorado, whose matchless mind was the talk of the world. Tabor set Baby Doe up in style, and as soon as he could divorce his prim wife, he married her. They built a mansion in Denver and spent $10,000 a week. Then the U.S. stopped buying silver, and Tabor's millions vanished. But Baby Doe stayed with him. Dying penniless, Haw cried, "Hang on to the matchless." So she did, and in 1935 was found in a cabin at the mine, frozen to death. Now her tragic tale lives on in the opera, The Ballad of Baby Doe. Alright, so I thought I'd find a lot more about Baby Doe in here, but that is all that they had to say. But I didn't expect to find anything about Julia Bulette. Now, while I did find something in here about Julia Bulette, it is a fantastical tale, full of total untruths, but it's very amusing anyway, so we're just going to read it. And fittingly, that picture I just showed you of Julia Bulette has also been debunked. That's definitely not a picture of Julia Bulette, but you see it pop up from time to time as a new sighting of her or whatever. Interestingly enough, I forgot to tell you guys, pictures of Lola Montez also sometimes get mistaken as pictures of Julia Bulette because they were, for a brief time, in the same area. They had a similar look, but Julia Bulette is not Lola Montez, and she is not whoever this nice lady is either. Against this background, the famous prostitutes of the West, such as Julia Bulette, may perhaps be glimpsed as the miners once saw them. When Julia Bulette came to Virginia City in 1859, she was the only unattached white woman in that incredible town. Miners by the hundred and later by the thousands were burrowing into the Comstock lode, from which eventually they were to make more than $300 million in gold and silver. But the money meant little without something to spend it on, and that Miss Bulette provided. She was young, she had a particularly lively and engaging personality, and she may have been very pretty by the standards of the time. Because of the wealth of the miners and her virtual monopoly of trade, Miss Bulette commanded exceedingly high prices, reputedly as much as $1,000 per evening. These are fantastic tales. Very soon, she collected a considerable fortune, and with it, a great Rococo house known as Julia's Palace, which she stuffed with pleasant young girls from San Francisco. This one I've heard before. I don't know where these stories come from. It became the center of the social life in Virginia City, but it was not a brawling, boisterous bawdy house. Julia imported fine wines, served delightful French cuisine, dressed herself and her girls in the latest Parisian style, and almost daily decked her palace with fresh-cut flowers rushed by Wells Fargo Express from San Francisco. Oh, really, did they? To the lonely, rugged miners, she brought touches of long-forgotten grace and gentility. Her house was the only real home that many of them knew. They thought she was a lady and they loved her. One of the few official tributes they could give her was to make her an honorary member of the Virginia City Fire Company, and on the 4th of July, 1861, at the summit of her career, she led a parade through the city, riding in a fire truck and carrying a fireman's trumpet filled with fresh roses, while her delighted boys marched in red shirts ranked behind her. That part's true, about the fire department and the parade. When several hundred miners became ill from drinking polluted water, Julia turned her palace into a hospital and herself into a nurse. That reminds me of Belle Wattlin from Gone with the Wind. During the Civil War, she raised huge sums for Lincoln's Sanitary Commission, the Red Cross of its day. But as Virginia City grew in size and hundreds of proper ladies and gentlemen moved into the community, Julia Bulette's status began to change. Her boys still loved her, but the forces of uplift were becoming too powerful. She could no longer sit in the orchestra of the theater surrounded by dozens of admiring men. Instead, she occupied a box at the side, partially curtained off to keep the glares of the righteous. In 1867, attracted by Julia's storied collection of jewelry, Three thugs crept into her palace on a winter's night and strangled her in her bed. Her funeral was perhaps the most impressive Nevada has ever seen. Thousands of men, led by the firemen and the state militia band, mournfully followed her body to its grave in unconsecrated ground, while the respectable elements of Virginia City remained indoors behind drawn shutters. On the way home, the band, not in levity, cut loose with the gay marching strain, "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and the miners wept. The shortage of women created a climate in which the Julia Bulettes might bloom in brilliant scarlet. So that's also very not true about three thugs creeping into the palace. It was not a palace, as mentioned. She was never even a madam. She was an independent, and she had her own nice, respectable little crib on the line. And she was killed by one guy, John Mullane, who they caught and they hanged. And that's not a big secret. Even Mark Twain, who was visiting Virginia City at the time, he had worked there before, wrote an article in the journal that he was writing for at the time, like the newspaper. He wrote an article for them about witnessing the hanging of John Mullane, and he kind of told the story a little bit of Julia Bulette. So in 1959, they definitely should have known that at least. And if you want to tell the story of Julia's palace, you at least have to say, oh, well, by this time, her fortunes had waned, because we know the house that she was killed in, and it was not a palace. And they found the guy who killed her, and it wasn't three of them. Well, what can we say? Okay, so the last one in here that I'm going to read today was my favorite, and one that I was surprised that I'd never heard of before. So I grew up in the Mormon church, and I am not a member of that church anymore. I don't practice that religion, but I still consider myself to be a Mormon. My family members joined the church way back in the days of Joseph Smith's, like the very beginning of the church. And I even have an ancestor who is mentioned by name in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I've always loved the history of the Mormon people. And the Mormon church nowadays, their prophet actually told them that they're not allowed to call themselves Mormons anymore. So since they have disavowed that term, I will embrace it warmly and say, yeah, absolutely, I am a Mormon. And I loved studying our history back then. I love it even more now. Because when you're a Mormon and you look back at the history of the prophets and the apostles and everyone, you kind of have to justify them or figure out a way to make them a good guy, even when they're doing like blatantly awful things. Once you leave that religion and you just embrace it as a history of your people, you're more open to saying, okay, well, this guy did a bad thing and we're gonna learn from that and not do that again. You don't have to be like, oh, well, the Lord must have told him. Oh, you don't have to tie yourself into knots over it. So I even served my mission in the Mormon Trail Center, so I love Mormon history, learned all about it, had never heard about this person before I stumbled across this article. Trouble from number 19. One place in the West where women were not scarce was in the Mormon community at Salt Lake City. Brigham Young, head of the church, had 19 wives by one reckoning and as many as 27 by another, depending on how one classified the several widows of Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, who Brigham kindly married after Smith's death. If they were excluded, Brigham had only 19. And one may be certain he had wished that he had stopped at 18 because the 19th gave him a lot of trouble. Her name was Eliza Webb. She was 24 years old and Brigham 67 when they were married in 1869. I think he went on to have at least like 40 wives, and by some counts like up into the 70s. Like it was some real like Warren Jeffs shit going on over there. If you want to know the truth. Although Miss Webb later denied that she had ever really wanted to marry Brigham, the truth is that she probably did. As her mother said to her, "Why, my dear, what is the matter? Are you crying because the head of our church, the most powerful and influential man among us, has made you an offer of marriage? Why, that is nothing to cry about, surely." So this article is written by someone, this guy, Robert Wallace. Is he a Mormon? Because the way that he speaks in such outraged tones about Eliza Webb, it reminds me of that book that stupid guy wrote, trying to make Sandy Bentley sound all like terrible, like the worst person, and I ended up totally loving her and thinking like, yeah, Sandy's that bitch. That's 100% what I felt upon reading this article about Eliza Webb, who I'd never heard of before. She's great. And also, yeah, so her mom told a story about how she burst into tears when Brigham Young asked her to marry him. He commanded her to marry him. So she started crying, and this guy's like, "Oh, well, obviously she was secretly happy about it." This guy's great. Okay, anyway, it was indeed an honor to be one of Brigham Young's wives. It gave a girl very high standing, both in this world and the next, and with it went an assurance of considerable material comforts. Brigham was a wealthy man, and it was the custom for Mormons to treat all of their wives equally. Tall tales indeed. But according to Miss Webb, Brigham gave her a flinty deal. She wanted a house of her own, which she got, but the furniture was cheap, the carpeting secondhand, and the china a battered collection of old junk that Brigham had salvaged from a bakery. Oh, and he only gave her one new dress a year. Eliza said that when she asked for more support, he suggested she take in more boarders, and when it was time for a new stove, he became angry and told her to get it herself. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of material comfort. I bet she's really enjoying her high standing. Oh, and the reason that he bought her that house is so that she could take in boarders, so she could support herself and whatever children she would have, because Brigham Young sure as hell wasn't going to do it. That's the way it was. Raging, Eliza decided to do a horrendous and unheard of thing. She filed suit to divorce Brigham Young, and when the news reached the rest of the country, she became a celebrity overnight. The nation had long taken a black view of Mormonism and was willing to believe any dreadful thing Eliza might say about her cruel life of bondage. She went on a lecture tour, speaking to huge, shocked audiences in Denver, New York, and Boston. When she hit Washington, Congress closed up shop for 2 hours to listen to her. Between lectures, she wrote a book called Wife Number 19 that shocked more thousands who had not had the opportunity to see her in person. The harm Eliza did to the cause of Mormonism is beyond calculation. Her lectures and her book were certainly one-sided and probably untruthful in many ways. The horrors of polygamy were much exaggerated. Relatively few wealthy Mormons practiced it, and the Mormons in general were, as they are today, fine, God-fearing people. but it has taken them years to live down the damage done by Eliza, who ranks as one of the all-time champion female hellraisers of the West. Hell yeah. I know you didn't mean that to be a compliment, Robert, but it was. Maybe he's not Mormon, maybe he's just mad because Eliza and going and talking to Congress is one reason that when Utah was to be accepted into the nation as a state and not a territory anymore, they pretty much said, hey, Utah, we don't love this polygamy thing, and we're not going to let you into our civilized country until you quit treating your women like cattle. And so the prophet, he had a miraculous revelation from God, and God said, okay, we can quit polygamy now. I know that I said before that it was like one of the most important things to be saved and to go to the celestial kingdom, but I totally changed my mind now, guys, because I'm God and I just do that whenever I feel like it. And just call up the prophet and he'll let you know what I'm thinking today. Oh my gosh. So, after reading that, I had never heard of Eliza Webb Young before, but I found this fantastic book that she wrote, and I kind of suspected that it might be like a 400-page, pretty understandable diatribe against Brigham Young and like what a total jerk he was, but it actually isn't. She talks a lot about the founding of Mormonism. She talks about Nauvoo. She talks about the mob violence in Missouri and in Illinois. She talks about the trek to winter quarters. She talks about the trek from winter quarters to the valley. She talks about the crickets. She talks about, it's so interesting. It's a really interesting story about the Genesis and Exodus of the Mormon people. It's absolutely fascinating. And her relationship with her mother and father. Her father was, they weren't dirt poor, but they were pretty poor, and he was also a practicing polygamist. I don't know where they get this ridiculous, only a few wealthy people practice polygamy. That's totally not true. And also they love to skew those numbers because they'll say, oh, well, only this many percentage of people actually practice Mormonism or practice polygamy in Mormonism. And that's because the women, when they count it, your 7 wives in polygamy, none of them are practicing polygamy because they're only married to one person, so they keep them off of those numbers. And yeah, that's kind of how polygamy works, you guys. When one man gets 7 wives, that means that there are 6 men out there who are not gonna get a wife because, babies are born roughly 50-50, male and female. So yeah, a lot of the men didn't practice polygamy because they didn't get married at all, did they? They got tossed out like the Lost Boys. It was seriously like the FLDS, like Colorado City, Warren Jeffs stuff. Yeah, the beginnings of our church was a lot like that. But this is a super interesting book, and she talks about a lot of different aspects of the history of the Mormon church. So I'm definitely going to read some of this, and we'll dive more into that. I've been learning so much about all these really interesting wild women of the West, and I'm kind of going down like a rabbit hole with that, so I'm probably going to talk a lot more about those characters in the future. And, no, I'm going to talk about that next time. Just kidding. Okay, so don't do anything I wouldn't do, and I'll catch you on the flip side.